Welcome to St Cross, everybody. My name's Naomi and I'm the librarian at Balliol. And I'm going to start without further ado talking about Shakespeare in our collections and the spring exhibition. So, as you all probably know, Shakespeare died on the 23rd of April, 1616. Now, you would have thought that in 400 years we'd have got over that. But judging by the events and exhibitions put on this year for the anniversary, we haven't. Balliol puts on 2 exhibitions a year, one in September for Open Doors Oxford and another one at this time of year in the spring to keep us out of mischief. So spring 2016 seemed like a really good opportunity to find out what Balliol has to do with Shakespeare. Currently, undergraduates studying English literature have to produce a portfolio of essays on Shakespeare towards their final examinations. And so an ulterior motive for doing this research on our collections was to find out what we had that could support that part of the course. When I was an English literature undergraduate studying Hamlet Q1, Q2, F1, and wondering whether I'd slipped into an algebra class by accident, I really wish someone had shown me the striking physical difference between the big folio and the more ephemeral, smaller quartos. In planning the exhibition, I also had in mind that Shakespeare would be a great thing to talk about with the school children who come to us as part of the school's liaison programme at Balliol. Shakespeare usually rings a bell, even with school children, unlike the name of Shakespeare's dramatic rival, Ben Jonson, whose folio title page you can see up there. A group who visited recently suggested to me he might as well have been called John Smith. I mean, who knows what Ben Jonson did with such an undistinguished name. Luckily, the Latin motto you can see up there actually translates as, "I do not work, so I'll be admired by the crowd, but am content with a few readers." So it's okay. The school group who I was talking to were the first one to benefit from the new knowledge that I had of Shakespeare's in our collections. We had a very fruitful session together. We compared Ben Jonson's folio title page with James I's folio title page, both published in 1616, the year of Shakespeare's death. And we compared them with Shakespeare's second folio title page, which you can see up there. And I should explain at this point that when people talk about folio in this context, they mean the biggest, most prestigious format of publishing, and the quartos are the next size down, so they're cheaper to produce. As the children discovered, Ben Jonson's title page and James I's title page are quite similarly laid out, and they have lots of imagery that a 17th century consumer would interpret. For example, there's 3 small pictures, can you see on Jonson's title page, 2 at the bottom and 1 at the top, and these represent the 3 eras of theatre. So the wagon at the bottom belongs to an ancient Greek called Thespis, who's thought to have been the first actor, and also to maybe have invented the travelling theatre, carrying all his props along with him in the wagon. And the other 2 pictures refer to the ancient Greek theatre, and at the top the Roman theatre, like the Colosseum. So you have to read this title page in the context that Ben Jonson's was the first published collection of an author's plays. Previous collected works had left out the theatre because it was thought of as maybe a less prestigious literary genre. So in pointing to the classical roots of theatre, Ben Jonson might be, and we know that he had input into this title page, not just his publisher, so we can say Ben Jonson. So Ben Jonson's saying that his plays have a ancient pedigree and maybe should be taken seriously. But there are very complex allusions in this title page, and each image is working in more than one way. So, for example, the cart is of a contemporary English design, and so it might be pointing to the so Ben Jonson's theatrical origins as a strolling player. He possibly is saying that he's done very well from his humble origins, and those origins had been mocked by his contemporaries, so he had a reason to show off a little bit. Also, a recent article in the most recent edition of Notes and Queries has pointed out that this Latin tag, visorium, need to run up, but down there on the ancient Greek theatre isn't the normal Latin tag for theatres. It's a Renaissance Latin coinage, and it could be a pun, referring to this device pictured here in a printer's studio, which held the text so that the typesetter could compose the text and look at the text at the same time, the visorium. And in this way, Johnson might be making a connection for his readers between the printed page and the theatre, and saying that there should be comparison between them rather than being seen as two very separate genres for different audiences. So you can see it's a complex title page, and it's the title page that blazed the trail that Shakespeare's colleagues followed in with the first folio. But then in contrast, that's the second folio, but the first folio looked very similar. It just has this big picture of the author, as if sort of implying that no more introductions needed at this point. And I think it's not surprising that's become iconic in some ways. So a topical public exhibition, material for college teaching, and an engaging school session. With all these benefits in mind, I very confidently put Shakespeare into our exhibition plan for spring 2016. But as the time drew closer to research and write the exhibition, I began to have my doubts. So college collections like Balliol's are very eclectic, and in my experience you can use them to talk about almost anything. But Shakespeare, I thought, did we really have enough to make an exhibition? And anyway, what was his year of matriculation from the college? In his essay in this book of homage to Shakespeare, which is a big Dulux limited edition published 100 years ago on the same anniversary in Oxford, Frederick S. Boas, who is an early modern a writer about early modern theatre, who matriculated from Balliol in 1881, he writes about Shakespeare's connections with Oxford. And it's known that Shakespeare visited Oxford quite a bit because he travelled between Stratford-upon-Avon and London and stopped here on the way. But at the time, the university had its own theatre to protect, and it was paying professional players to go away. So it's very unlikely that Shakespeare actually had much to do with the university itself. And Boas points out that the only reference to the university in Shakespeare's plays is a conversation between the Gloucestershire justices in Henry IV Part 2. And they're talking about the cost rather than the quality of the education. So it goes something like this. Shallow says, "I dare say my cousin William is become a good scholar. He is at Oxford still, is he not?" And Silence says, "Indeed, sir, to my cost." So it's not really emphasising the quality of the education here. Also from 1584, Oxford University's authorities actually banned common stage players from performing within the precincts of the university, and they also banned students from going outside to attend city plays. So even though we think that Shakespeare probably played the ghost of Hamlet in a performance in Oxford City, it's unlikely he ever haunted Balliol. Sorry. So I thought, what about the university's alternative to Shakespeare's theatre? What about this dramatic tradition that it was protecting? Well, a recently published collection of records of early English drama in Oxford shows that a lot of colleges actually spent quite a bit of money on theatrical productions. The expenses for comedies and tragedies crop up very regularly in Christchurch's accounts for the early 17th century, for example. And around the corner from Balliol at St John's, they have this manuscript that details a festival of student theatre that was held there in the Christmas period. That was October 1607 to February 1608, quite a long time. And it has in the manuscript 8 play texts that are both in Latin and English. Modern editors call this the Christmas Prince, after the name given to the Master of Ceremonies for the occasion. And this badge with a salamander wreathed in flames is the badge of office that the Christmas Prince held during his time as the Master of Ceremonies. Unfortunately, the extant accounts at Balliol give a slightly different picture. the only comparable item that we indulged in was the odd trumpeter for special occasions and ceremonial visits. So nothing there. So I was wondering, what was this college with a penchant for trumpets, but very little interest in drama, like in 1616, the year of Shakespeare's death? Well, John Jones's recent history paints us a picture of a single quadrangle of buildings backed by a confusion of gardens, paths, privies, stables and other outbuildings. And it was on the wrong side of the city walls as well. The single quad would have looked very like this picture that David Logan made later on in the 17th century. And some of the buildings are still there. The one on your left on the quad and the one at the back on the left at the quad are the medieval hall and the medieval library, respectively, and they now form the library building. John Jones' history tells us that the college was on the up at this point because student numbers were rising hand in hand with domestic profits. I think it might have been quite a studious place. The master in 1616 was Robert Abbott, and he was a strict man who put a lot of emphasis on attending your college teaching and your religious observances. Benefactions, which founded more fellowships and more scholarships, were very linked to this sort of rise in the college's fortune. And one strategy that I followed to find things that would be good for display in the exhibition was to look for things that were produced in 1616 or had something to do with 1616. And that included this map, which is of Lady Perryiam's Buckinghamshire estate. It was given to the college, and it founded one further fellowship and 2 further scholarships. Unfortunately, the map was too big and fragile to display in the exhibition, but donors came out as an important theme throughout. It was thanks to donors that our library isn't as devoid of 17th century drama as you might expect from such a serious sort of a college. The 2 Shakespeare quartos we have and the Ben Jonson folio were both given by donors in the late 17th, early 18th century. You can see those in the exhibition, and you can also see this, which is our second folio, Shakespeare. And this was given to us much nearer to its time of publication than any of the other 17th century drama in the exhibition. Its first owners were a Worcestershire family called the Jeffries, and they had some land at Ham Castle. And William Jeffries, who you can see has written his name across the title page there, he's the patriarch of the family. And then his son, Henry Jeffries, came to Balliol in July 1655. And as you can see from this inscription, he gave the book to us in 1656. And that's only 24 years after its date of publication, so it's quite close. It was common to give books to your college at this time on matriculation or graduation. But I think this is an unusual choice because the books given are usually to do with teaching, the subjects taught in the university. And also, as we've heard, the university wasn't that keen on professional drama, so it was, I think, an odd choice. This is the entry for Henry Jeffries' gifts in our library's donation register, and you can see from it that he gave 4 other titles alongside the Shakespeare by 2 other authors. Now, the second author, Richard Crackenthorpe, attended the Queen's College here in Oxford, and he was well known as a anti-Catholic, quite a controversial anti-Catholic preacher. And he was also friends with our rather serious master, Robert Abbott. 2 of those books given are his textbooks on logic and metaphysics, and they were really popular for teaching all the way through the 17th century, so much more what you'd expect from a donation to the college. We don't have those anymore in the library, but we do have these Crackenthorpe's 2 most famous works, and so it might suggest that Crackenthorpe was the sort of author that serious Balliol men at the time were interested in reading. We think they're quite contemporary donations. We also have a copy of the last book that Jeffries gave us, the work on logic, another kind of scholarly tome by German philosopher and theologian Christoph Scheibler. But I don't think that this copy that we have is the copy that Jeffries gave us, because it's got an inscription, you can see there, that tells us it came from the library of New Inn Hall, which merged with Balliol in 1887, and we got its library then, so that's much later. I'd really like to know why Jeffries gave us the Shakespeare, and why it's the only thing we've got left that he did give us, but I don't know the answers. Another question that occurred to me was, once the second folio was in the library, who was borrowing it? Was anyone reading it? Now, it's hard to answer because we don't have many records of library use from that period, but we do have quite a rare survival, which is a 17th, 18th century borrowing register. It's kept up intermittently from 1677 through to 1712, and from it we can tell that on the 20th of February 1706, Henry Kingsmill borrows Shakespeare, and Henry Kingsmill should be young Henry Kingsmill because he had only come to the college the year before, age only 15 years. So he's a student, and we know he came from a minor family of the minor nobility in Hampshire, but we don't know much more about him because unfortunately he died when he was 20. So the only reader of Shakespeare we know is someone we don't know much about. He's just another ghost. So, as well as searching for 1616 in our catalogues, my other search strategies for this exhibition were also pretty simple. I looked on Solo for early printed books that had subject headings that were relevant in their catalogue record, such as theatre, and it's in this way that I found that we had a copy of William Prynne's amazing Puritan Rant, which on closer inspection does actually reference Shakespeare directly. It objects to the immoral print quality of his first folio, which was far better than most Bibles, and it shouldn't have been. I also obviously looked for records that had Shakespeare in them anywhere, and from that I found items that I could then read around and look for other things that went with them in the exhibition. And this strategy took me on some really interesting journeys. It took me into the history of the curatorship of the collection, it took me into 18th century satire, and it also took me into outer space, which I really wasn't expecting. So, two of the most notable books that we have in the library that have Shakespeare in their catalogue record are Shakespeare's two quartos that we have here, 1611 Hamlet and The Merry Wives of Windsor, published in 1619. Now, it's really exciting to have these here to use for teaching and to put on display in exhibition, but actually they led me to a book that I found much more interesting in some ways, and to go back to the title of the talk, this is a book that I found was quite haunted in many respects. So the book in question is a book that is on display, and it's the one that's on your left, nearest to me, so you can have a look at it. It was put together by a man called George Coningsby, its 18th century former owner, and he died in 1766 and left his big library to his college, Balliol. But his agency sort of lingers in all his books, to carry on the ghostly theme, both in that he left a lot of notes in his books, and also in this case because he chose what to bind together in one big volume. And as you'll see from his title page to the volume that I'm displaying here, it's his collection of 17th century drama, and he's chosen to bind Shakespeare's quartos in with lots of other 17th century dramatists like John Webster, Edward Ravenscroft, Aphra Behn, John Dryden, and some of them are better known than others today. So items 15 and 16 on this list are the last ghostly traces of the quartos in this volume. They're not in there anymore. And underneath you can see a rather cryptic note about their 19th century curation. It says, tracts 15 and 16 were taken out of this volume. They are rebound and will be found in the glass case. So the glass case is now a phantom location as well. It's sort of disappeared without trace. Nowadays, we wouldn't touch bind-ups like this as curators. We'd leave them as they are, so that to preserve the reader history, no matter what relative value we placed on the individual texts in them. And we're really lucky that the librarian in this case left notes. There's the rebinding. He left notes both in Coningsby's volume and in the volumes themselves, about where they were and how they related to each other, and we can still match them up and know about that 18th century ownership information, which we might have otherwise lost. So I said that Coningsby's collection was haunted in more ways than one, as well as these ghostly vestiges of amputated plays. It also contains points where Shakespeare actually manifests. The first of these is the first item in the bind-up, which is a catalogue of all printed plays up to 1680. And it attributes to Shakespeare many plays that we wouldn't now think of part of his canon, like The Arraignment of Paris, The London Prodigal, The Merry Devil of Edmonton, and lots of others. And then in one of the plays in this bind-up, Shakespeare's ghost actually manifests and comes on stage. This is John Dryden's rewrite of Troilus and Cressida. And in it, the main actor, Mr. Betterton, comes onto the stage, and he later plays the main role as well. He's the romantic lead, he's Troilus. But first he comes onto the stage to introduce the play, and you can see there's a picture of him in that engraving, wearing a lovely wig and playing Hamlet. He's the one on your left. The prologue here excuses Dryden from plagiarism. So Shakespeare's ghost is excusing Dryden's plagiarism, saying, "In this my rough-drawn play you shall behold some master strokes, so manly and so bold, that he who meant to alter found them such, he shook and thought it sacrilege to touch." So I guess Dryden's used bits from Shakespeare, but that's okay because Shakespeare's such a good author that it would have been sacrilege to take them apart. Less than 100 years on, Shakespeare already has a reputation as a national poet. He's compared in this to Fruitful Britain, but I think this volume shows that his plays are more fluid than we might think of them today. A layperson like me imagines him as having a very fixed canon, and it obviously wasn't so. Coningsby seems to have been interested in Shakespeare generally. All the things in the 18th century part of this exhibition belong to him. The earliest edition that he gave us of Shakespeare's works is Alexander Pope's edition of 1725, which is the title page. And Pope's better known now as a satirist and a sharp wit, and someone you wouldn't criticise without some trepidation. So when his contemporary Lewis Theobald wrote this criticism of his edition of Shakespeare, including 132 pages on all his editorial mistakes in Hamlet, Pope decided to return the compliment by making Theobald the main character in his satire on hack writers. He made him Tybalt, King of the Dunces, in the Dunciad. And Pope, there's the Dunciad, there's our copy of the Dunciad, which you can see for real. And Pope's a funny bloke. He uses the textual apparatus around the poem itself, such as the index and the footnotes that he makes up for his text, to really point out who is the butt of this joke. He doesn't leave you in any doubt. So in the index, for example, where this is the index of persons celebrated in the poem. He gives everybody their page numbers where they're referenced, but Theobald gets passim, which means throughout. So the whole thing's on him. So if our 18th century Shakespeare editors are in Coningsby's collection, Balliol's 20th century editors are actually here at Balliol in the 20th century. That we've got letters of A.C. Bradley and J.C. Maxwell, which I'm not going to show because you can go and see them. And they, rather unsurprisingly, give an amazing window onto the great Shakespeare scholarship that they were involved in at the beginning of the 20th century. Rather more unexpectedly was a connection that came up between a really great 20th century novelist, Star Trek, and Shakespeare. So Robertson Davies went on to become one of Canada's really great 20th century authors, and is well known for his novels. But in the 1930s, he was a student here at Balliol, and he published his B.Lit thesis like this, as Shakespeare's boy actors. This is the note that he left in the copy that he gave to Balliol, and it explains, among other things, the publication history of his book. So he says, Dents published the book, war came, and most of the copies were pulped. After the war, Dent sold the rights to an American firm, Russell & Russell, who brought it out in 1964. All this without reference to me. I suppose they thought I was dead. And this last sentiment seemed to me the sort of thing that Shakespeare's ghost might say if he came back and saw the centuries of criticism and argument and interpretation of his plays since his death. So it became the title for the exhibition. Now, at this point, Robertson Davies was very much still alive and well, and still interested in Shakespeare as well. After having worked in the UK for a bit, he returned to Canada and helped to found the Stratford Shakespearean Festival, which, if you're Canadian or if you're into Shakespeare, I think you know about. It's a world-renowned festival of Shakespeare, and it attracts lots of actors and directors from around the world today. And Balliol's library, thanks to Robertson Davies, has its first 3 programmes, but when I say programmes, they're lavishly illustrated hardback books detailing everything that happened in the festival. They're not what you might think of a programme. This festival launched the careers of many well-known actors, and possibly most well known is this chap playing Lucentio in 1934, Taming of the Shrew. And if you don't recognise him yet, he went on to boldly go where no man's gone before as Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise. So that was a nice connection. The 20th century is also where Balliol's students' official involvement with Shakespeare begins. But there are a lot of tantalising glimpses earlier on in the centuries, like young Henry Kingsmill's entry in the Borrowing Register, and also this great 19th century notebook kept by a student society who met and were dedicated to reading the plays of Shakespeare. So you've got the members of the society, you've got individual cast lists for the plays they were reading out, and you've also got, I think my favourite thing is the list of the plays read and then whose rooms they were read in another column. So Shakespeare's now fully manifest in Oxford, I think. You'll be able to see that by listening to our current English finalists talking about their essays at the end of the exhibition. And thanks to Balliol's master, Benjamin Jowett, who authorised the production of Shakespearean and Greek plays by students of the university when he was Vice-Chancellor in the 1880s. They could finally put on Shakespeare's plays, and they still do frequently. And I'd like to leave you with some pictures of our graduates performing 3 love scenes from Shakespeare's plays at the public opening for this exhibition earlier on in the year. That's all I have to say, but if you've got any questions, please go ahead. I'll try and answer them, and otherwise we can have a look at the exhibition. Thank you.